Yeah. Was that right?
Yeah. So police was right next door. That's what we got to talk. We're here for our next work session. It is, kind of 2:40. On the agenda reform that we discussed at the work session before. We have, after that, I've made notes. Many of you promised to give me comments. Mr. Constant actually came through and did. And I incorporated both his and some of the discussion into, so you have the original, you have Mr. Constant's amendment, and then at the bottom is in yellow some of the changes. And I want to step through them, and then this is probably going to end up, though I've tried to...
Mr. Groff?
Yeah.
There is no yellow. You got black and white copies.
It's inside. Highlighted
Keep
version
going.
at the bottom.
So you have on top the original,
Gotcha.
in between constant amendments, and then after that, yellow version. That takes some of constant amendments and some other things.
That must be the
Everyone on that? Mr. Dyson, do you see the yellow changes?
I do.
Okay, good. Yeah, you're ahead of Mr. Dunbar.
Not often.
Okay, so, and maybe this is a thing that just, it's chicken and egg, right? If you give it to the new people, they're going to be like, I don't know how this works yet. I don't know how to do it. So it could be something we want to set and hand over, or maybe hand over with more discussion. Here's what I propose changes after listening to comments last time. So going in order, on page 3 at the top, people said it's not just the agenda, it's the agenda and the addendum. And I think that's understood, but we said that. Next is deleting this whole exceptional circumstances. And while that seems dramatic, the reason is our charter already has this emergency ordinance part. So our Constitution, if you will, which we repeat in G, and Dean doesn't like me repeating parts of the charter in the ordinance, and it sets this 3/4 declared an emergency. It's very specific on what it requires, and it requires a 3/4 vote. So without that, we kind of had this kind of exceptional and then very exceptional, and it just was confusing me. So really, you said we're only going to consider if they haven't been on the agenda. It's got to be an emergency ordinance under the charter, or it's got to be introduction of a thing, which you always have the right to do with 2 other members that do. So I can just say, hey, it wasn't on the agenda, but I am introducing this thing that I just thought up, and you appear to have that power under the charter. As long as you get 2 other people to go along with you, it's introduced. Now, that's not so bad, right? The public didn't get notice of that, but you're not acting on it then either, so they will get notice pretty soon. And you seem to have that, or it has to be an emergency declaration. Think about that. Moving on to page 4. See ya. Page 4, I had used 2 different ways of talking about whether an S version or an amendment was put on. Here's the concept, that if you put your amendment or your S version in time, in the agenda time, then the public had notice of it. Take what we were just doing before. If we say, hey, there's a taxi deregulation and there's taxi cab light. If you both of those hit the agenda, then the world, the public, can know we're going to be looking at these 2 different things. If I'd only said taxi cab light and then throw an S version on Tuesday that is complete deregulation, you can make a good argument the public didn't have any idea that kind of a thing was going to come on. And you ought to then have this process where you say, did we so fundamentally change this that we ought to hold it over for another period of time? That we ought to give some more notice? Nobody would have known this radical a thing was on. And the way to solve it is to say, no, they did know that because I put both the deregulation version and the light version on, and they both were on the Friday agenda. So if you're interested in this topic, you would have known deregulation was a possibility. if you gave them enough notice, then you don't, if that passes, you don't have to hold it over for another week. But and so I essentially incorporated all that language into the top of 5. So now the top of 5 says some of Mr. Constant's stuff and some of this. It says, it used to say chair, it now says if the assembly determines the changes made in the ordinance. It used to say change the basic character. That's from those court cases that force you to do it. I pulled it back a little and said the public was denied a meaningful opportunity to comment. And then I said what Mr. Constant essentially wanted: the assembly chair shall make an initial determination which may be overruled by a majority of the assembly. And generally, if an amendment or an S version was included on an agenda, then the public has been given a meaningful opportunity to comment on that change. If you knew it, you knew it. Mr. Constant said rightly at the bottom of page 5, additional wasn't necessary, and we should be keeping it.
Mr. Chair?
Yeah.
Can I get in the queue?
I think it's up for time, so you can not only get in the queue, we can talk to you. And then
Thank you. I want to go back to page 3, and try to remember our earlier discussion about this. It appears like what you have done here, and correct me if I'm wrong, is sort of forbid laid on the table items, except for the introduction of an ordinance. Is that correct?
except for an emergency ordinance or introduction, yes.
So I want to counsel why that might not be wise. We receive a lot of resolutions from the administration that are sort of late breaking that have to do with contracts and other financial matters that, you know, get done, kind of need to go right then. And I thought we had kept that in there for that purpose. Because the phrase, immediate assembly action on a matter is essential to be meaningful and cannot be delayed. So Mr. Falsey or Mr. Schutte isn't here. I recall that they're usually the ones that are sort of talking about those kind of matters. They're not ordinances, but they are time sensitive.
Yeah, Mr. Conlon.
So I have, one of the amendments that didn't get incorporated in was to address that question. I wasn't at the work session, I'm sorry, I was traveling, but I believe that to narrow the definition strictly to what is constituted as an emergency under the charter strips away too much flexibility. And so what I've proposed to answer that question is that by a 2/3 vote, a matter could be deemed meaningful and significant enough that we take it up immediately. And just would have to be enough members of the body saying this is important that we do this now. So that it's not, I thought even to say by unanimous consent, right? It was a unanimous vote, but I think that's an extraordinary bar. And you could have one person frustrate everybody by doing that. And so that's my 1A right there, addresses that question, and it says by 2/3 vote, we can determine that the thing is meaningful and cannot be delayed.
Well, it could be, so is that 8 members then? Because that's what his language in here said 8 members. If we left something, if we incorporated it into the consent agenda and didn't pull it, then you've got 8 or 11 people have voted for it in practice, so you've satisfied this requirement. If somebody pulled it, then there would be an 8. Well, I don't know though, because then you've considered it, right? Because this saying you can't even consider something unless people vote for it.
So, Mr. Training next, but it seems to me that we need to be really precise then if we have emergencies and exceptional, kind of what we mean by both, right? And having these 2/3 and a 3/4, and maybe I went too far in just getting rid of it. It was looking at like what? And be precise about how this is not an emergency ordinance under our charter, Mr. Training.
So what are you saying? You want 2/3 or
3/4, whatever the number is, it's not so important to me, but what's important is to allow us the flexibility in the case that it's not a charter emergency that takes a declaration of an emergency, but we could still continue doing the business that's necessary. I think contracts that are time specific that came up out of nowhere is important. I think there are just other times when there are questions that come before us that we're going to generally, or even in a super way, agree this is important to deal with today.
Chris? It only takes majority to pass anything. It takes a majority to change the chairman.
But not if this passes, right? If
You
this
can
passes,
still change the chairman with 6 votes. Whoever's got 6 votes can change the chairman.
but that'll never happen. I mean, it could.
Oh yes, it has. You want me to give you names?
No, but it wouldn't stop this. Even if you change the chairman chairperson.
If the code says you can't do it, then you can't do it.
Well, and also the item would be before you regardless of whether the chairperson wants it or not.
We can keep changing chairman and it still have these rules. But I mean, okay, so it's a fundamental question, you guys, laid on the table. That is something that nobody ever saw, didn't see Friday to the extent they're asking, and here Monday, Tuesday, we're talking about it. Under what conditions should we do that? Now, we sometimes, various times, Mr. Trini can give us his history lesson, but it's gotten to be where that was used a lot. I think it's used only medium kind of now. But it's a poor practice, right? It's a bad way to do it. So how much leeway do you want to give yourself to do it? Complete, we do it anytime we want. I think that's a bad idea, but you could do it. All the way up to these restrictions. And I think we at least have to be clear about when we're going to police ourselves, right? When we're going to and when we're not. And so we're setting standards for ourselves to say, we can overrule them, but what do we want ourselves to consider? It's like the ethics consideration. We sit there and say, you have a conflict or you don't have a conflict based on good rules that we've thought about and set up. So when do we think it is appropriate to out of the blue drop something on the public and pass it? I've lost track of the thing, but Ms. Anderson.
Can I just say, but to remind that this appears to be only laid on the table items that don't require public hearings. Because if they require a public hearing, then they're going to be a week or 2 weeks off. So that would be, it seems, the contracts, your resolutions, because the other thing that the administration wants to often do in a rush is an appropriation, but that requires the hearing. They may lay it on the table for introduction, which is allowed. So it seems like a limited subset of actions that could be laid on the table without a public hearing.
Okay, so kind of D, so maybe we ought to say that, Mr. Constable.
I wonder, though, if that's necessarily true, because then we get into the question of, is this a substantial change or not, to an item that's up for public hearing's closed, it's an ordinance, and we're working on it, and someone comes up and says, I got this, do we need to wait? Or is this an emergency? You know, that's like an area, and I'm not sure that I'm 100% tracking, but I think there are some questions that are broader than that narrow bandwidth. But you're right, mostly it is resolutions that get laid on the table that are less than $100,000 that don't require public, $100,000.
So in talking to the clerk's office and thinking about this and going over it, it's kind of 3 areas. It is stuff that just gets laid on and acted that night, subset as Dee said. Those usually aren't appropriations. And we said later, I think you can do things that don't have other resolutions not requiring a public hearing may be introduced and amended without the need for public testimony. I mean, if you don't need public testimony, you don't need public testimony, so you can just do it however you want. And that's resolutions honoring the Boy Scouts and somebody who's been there for 30 years. It didn't have to fit those requirements.
It doesn't need a public hearing. This resolution is simple. Just bring the resolution like Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, whatever. It doesn't need a public hearing. You can do those.
I know.
It's just we've had some mayors come in there and they like to drop things the last minute late on the table items. Some don't. This administration is very good about it. I just don't want to tie your hands, because I won't be on the body, except for you guys. But I don't want to tie your hands.
Why don't you want to tie your hands?
Because I actually like some of you.
Well, no, I mean, I think we want to appropriately tie our hands, not inappropriately. We want to say, let's, okay, and then
But
the other.
you can't plan for every contingency.
The other thing that the clerk's office worries about is S versions that come out on Sunday or Monday that totally go a different direction. We kind of dealt with that in another place. So are you saying we have the right to introduce ordinances? Things that are not ordinances or don't need a public hearing aren't that dangerous?
Which is a limited subset.
Right.
Chair.
One did, Mr. Webb.
I guess that's, I mean, when we do the resolutions, it'll be like, should we accept this federal money to go to this fund or something? That's
Liquor license.
and that would be something that would be quick. Liquor licenses, do they get thrown on at the last?
Yeah, sometimes, right? And then
They
that's
don't feel
set for
process.
public hearing.
They're resolutions.
And so they just happen.
Yeah. And it depends on which actor they are and where they are in the process, but, yeah.
But if, so, right, if That's problematic. The public didn't know that was coming. So you can say, don't ever do this. And kind of the way I've suggested here is that, unless it's emergent, declared emergency, or your ability to introduce. Or you can say, but I think we need to say in A what we really need, right? The things that are allowable that the public didn't know about are this. Nice.
Yeah, so I'm trying to think about this, and I really appreciate it, Ray brought up. So my first assembly meeting, nearly 2 years ago, we made an amendment on the floor on a bill, and I said, wait a minute, the stakeholders here, are going to be kind of blindsided by it. So just think about this. I've just started, but make it so in our rules that any one of us who thinks we're going too fast, or there hasn't been a notification of stakeholders or the public, it's inappropriate for us to go forward. Any one of us can challenge taking the action that quickly because of the stakeholders, people with skin in the game, didn't get informed. And if one of us challenges, then it takes something to overrule that challenge.
So let's skip to that. So
Can I
that's
just-
on, can I deal with that one?
Well, I just want to comment to that. Can I just respond to that
Yeah.
real quick? I would argue that mechanism already exists, which is that mechanism already exists. Because you can, one, argue against the substance of the amendment, or you can make a motion to postpone the whole thing. Say, okay, this is what's going forward right now,
Yep.
and we've gone past where our stakeholders understand what we're doing. I make a motion to postpone until the next meeting. And then, and then there'll be up and down vote on that motion. So
Yeah.
I would argue we already have the rhetorical tools to
Okay,
do what
so
you're describing.
let me just point you to the section. So on page 5 at the top, Fred, is that thing. So we were talking about introduction kind of before,
Yep.
but now we're at the end game. And so that is, if the assembly, used to say assembly chair, but if the assembly determines the changes made to an ordinance during the meeting are so substantial that the public was denied a meaningful opportunity to comment, the assembly shall postpone action on the ordinance and set for an additional public hearing with 7 days. The assembly chair shall make the initial, and this is a lot of what you said, Chris, and which may be overruled by a majority. It really just, so you're both right?
Yeah.
We have the power. We're just sort of telling ourselves to take a look at this
Yep.
and use that power.
Yep.
So you're done with the thing. It's had a bunch of amendments in this version, and then amendments to that or whatever. Did the public have a meaningful opportunity to comment on this?
And the people with skin in the game.
Yeah, and the chair goes, I think we did. There weren't that big of changes, or I don't think so. Assembly can overrule him or her, but if you say that, if you say yeah, not really, then you hold it over for another meeting. At least 7 days. More likely it's 2 weeks, but it could be 7 days.
So, yeah, this comes to the philosophical question at the heart of the ordinance. And I tend to support it because it is clarifying. However, I think it's worth stating that in the parliamentary practice, there are Robert's rules, there's our code in the charter, but there's also custom and practice. And much of what we're doing here maybe is a result of the fact that we haven't approached the question of what are our practices maybe frequently enough to reinforce that there are certain ways we should behave here, customs. And so I am always hesitant to create rules that blind people going forward who are of good judgment and of good reputation and good background.
And good faith.
In good faith, we want to allow us in the future, when we're not here, to be able to do the work. And so although you're right, any given Tuesday you can introduce an ordinance to change this, to me I want us to be careful not to over-regulate ourselves in the process of trying to perfect our own process, which we can do in custom.
I think there's a mix of good customs and bad customs, and that having a discussion about, is this what we really mean to do? We've kind of fallen into doing this. Is this what we want to be doing? And you say, oh yeah, that's cool, or not really. We've started doing that and we don't. Training Dunbar or Dyson.
2012 was the last time we looked at this. As a result of the 2012 election. We had a group of about 30 people that came together, various aspects of Anchorage, to work on changing how we introduced ordinances. And this version and everything else. Because the 2012 election was a mess. We'll admit that. But, this works good. I'm just worried when you say meaningful opportunity. To find meaningful. As one person gets
You
up.
get to.
Is it one person that gets up and says, hey, that wasn't a meaningful opportunity, or do you want 2 or 3? You want more limits on it, or you just want to have that phrase out there, Eric?
The chair makes that call. So you, like an ethics determination, you sit there and say, yeah, I think it was. They can be saying, no, it wasn't, but, and then you look around and the assembly says, yeah, I think it was. I mean, it just forces you to make that thought. And Mr. Dunbar's right, I think, that you could have done it anyway. We could have done it. We're reminding ourselves to do it.
Yep, and that's really valuable.
Mr. Dunbar.
So, a couple things. The first, what Mr. Constant is saying is absolutely true, that bodies like ours rely on norms more than they do rules. And that's the case in almost every legislative body. But you can get someone like, for example, Mitch McConnell, who says, you know what, norms no longer matter. All that matters is what you can stop me from doing, and I'm going to use the maximalist interpretation of my power, and then, sort of a nihilistic vision of legislation. and it's made the U.S. Congress non-functioning, right? So far, in my 3 years, we haven't had a Mitch McConnell-like figure on the Assembly. But I can see, I'm not going to put anything on the record, but I can see in our existing rules how someone could grind us to a halt, and then we would have to find ways to stop that. It hasn't happened yet, and hopefully it'll never happen. I don't know if this necessarily would stop that. But I will say that here, I think there are sort of 2 different portions of this. The portion that talks with S versions and public hearing, and that portion of it, I have no issue with. I think what you've done here is pretty good, and I like that. I do want to come back to this section 3A, and Dee was talking about it a little bit too, and talk about, again, I don't think we want to limit our ability to lay on the table something that is a fast-acting grant or purchase or something like that. We already have the power to introduce ordinances. So then what are you left with preventing? You're preventing basically because it doesn't need public hearing, you're preventing the National Butterfly Day resolution, right, being laid on the table. And then you're not really preventing anything that's particularly meaningful to the public anyway. That makes sense. It's a little bit annoying for everybody to get to read it into the record and then read it right there on the night of, but it's not really frustrating the public. So I'm not comfortable with limiting our ability to do those actually important grants and purchases. And if I'm not limiting that, then I'm curious what of meaning we are limiting.
On that topic, I know Dyson's in the queue, but we have that card for the ethics question. Maybe we come up with a similar crosswalk for determining, depending on which way this goes, whether or not it really needs to be dealt with tonight.
Mr. Dyson?
No, nothing.
Yeah. So I meant the C to mean things that don't need public hearing, You don't have to say it, but so you can introduce things that don't need a public hearing can be introduced and amended without the need for. That's the very last thing.
But then I don't understand what 3A, I don't understand what it limits at all, or what 3 does. Because if we can already introduce ordinances, that's what's required public hearing. And you're saying we can lay on the table things that don't require public hearing? Then, so what's left? I guess resolutions that need public hearing?
Resolutions, appropriate, tell us some more.
Mostly contracts, last minute contracts.
Contracts.
Most appropriate, if they're over 100,000, they require public hearings.
Oh, okay.
Most of
Protests
ours-
of liquor and marijuana licenses?
That I don't know.
But in that
I think
case,
so.
why do we care that those are being laid on the table? Because there will be a public hearing on them.
For the larger appropriations
Yeah.
versus the contracts that are go AM consent agenda generally.
So we're worried that we might put, but those are exactly the kind of things I do want to go forward, because a lot of times those are
Exactly.
time sensitive, and the
Exactly.
administration's like, oh shit, we need to make this purchase right now.
So it came from a lot of concern about laid on the table from the clerk's office and others. But maybe you're right, the more precise we get, it is the end game, not the beginning game, that we're more concerned about. When you have amended or S version and you haven't told people an S version was coming out, you may want to put some back end protections, and the front end isn't that. Isn't there something?
I mean, when I was the chair, I was annoyed when people would lay a resolution on the table, because it just meant, you would have to read it, and everybody would have to read it really quickly, and it was just sort of annoying. It didn't actually harm the public much at all, because those resolutions are non-binding and typically pretty innocuous. But that seems to be the thing that you would be eliminating here. And by the way, it wouldn't eliminate people's ability to make those resolutions. It would just be like, you're going to put it on the regular agenda for next meeting, which is what we should, that's best practice anyway. you know, so maybe that's fine. If we were to change this to be more like Chris's, where it's like, you know, matter is essential to be meaningful and cannot be delayed, because to me, a lot of those contracts can fit into that.
That wasn't yours. That wasn't all you added was 2/3.
Only, yeah, I just wanted to
Well,
restore.
he restored your
The
deletion.
notion that there are some circumstances that aren't emergencies under the section 10 of the charter that would be warranted to move at the moment, not waiting 2 weeks.
Well, if they're innocuous, do we even need 8 or 3/4 or 2/3 or whatever? I mean, you just think they're not a problem. It's not a problem to throw stuff that the public didn't see, because either A, it doesn't have a public hearing, so it's none of your business anyway, public, or B, you're going to have a public hearing on it later, so what's the harm? It does seem like that's a little cavalier with, this is now popped up on the agenda, and I never knew about it if I'm a watcher.
Well, I was just gonna say, I wasn't comfortable with doing anything but a majority vote, because then you allow politics to be introduced. And why would you need more than a majority vote to consider whether it's meaningful and cannot be delayed?
As a mover of that, I'd be happy to make it a majority. I just thought that the whole point of the thing was to make it a little bit higher of a bar for introduction, so that people aren't just rushing to lay on the table, but instead is considering, well, I need more support even than 6. And so, but I'm happy for 6. If the will is there, that's really what we need to be, in my opinion.
Would that, Mr. Chair, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Would that mean that, for D or whoever else, would that mean that you have to get a majority vote 6 before it was even read onto the consent agenda? Wouldn't you have to? Because we make a motion to add something to the consent agenda, and then you have to pull it off the consent agenda. But you're considering it as soon as you've attached it to the consent agenda. So once you have to get a majority vote to even attach it.
Wouldn't that be the motion to introduce? And so that's the whole point of the motion to introduce. Is if you have an item laid on the table, I want this introduced, then you have a consideration of the question. And that's standard parliamentary procedure.
But we already take a vote on attaching the addendum to the agenda and laid on the table items. So in theory, you've already got a majority of people saying that this thing can now be considered.
If it were, in my mind, Mr. Chair, we have the action that happens when first you have a motion to incorporate, and then you have a motion to approve, right? And so there are multiple protections already in place. This effectively is that same motion, I would argue, that's already in place.
We do a surprising amount of things by resolution. We think it's ordinances, and that's not, but yeah, all the alcohol and marijuana that we spend a lot of time on is resolution based. Resolutions that require public hearings. They're doing, and business licenses and a lot of those things, which often, they don't bubble up as much as the alcohol and marijuana, but they're there. And they have real effects. I mean, they're not an AO, but they have real effects on real people's lives, and they have real people who are very interested in them. And just dropping them, I don't know, is it just okay because they're going to see it 2 weeks later and they didn't know it was going to pop up? Why not get it on that Friday agenda?
No, and so if I could, even getting it on the Friday agenda might not be necessarily meeting what your goal is. And I would use an example of recent introduction of an resolution on a Friday that, you know, well, only because it's instructive to the dilemma, right? I can speak to the other side, but the idea of proper time on matters when there's a constituency that hasn't been consulted about their own concern, right? Their own property, it seems like there are some reasons to have a heightened scrutiny on what we are approaching or how we're approaching a model, because, and so I'm talking myself in your corner, stopping here.
Yeah, no, I don't want to stop you. Like, you're talking about the 4th Avenue?
Yeah.
So it's like, that wasn't even binding, right? But it's important. And then there are ones that are a notch up from that. They're actually binding. They don't change a statute, but they give a license or deny a license or allow people to sell marijuana in a place. And so it's like they have real things. This one was hot, and it really didn't do a whole lot, but it was really
Got the
important.
public's attention, didn't it?
Yeah, and they were really
It
mad.
came out on a Friday before meeting on a Tuesday when all the parties couldn't be made aware of what was going on.
And
so
the intention was to postpone, and that never got
Yeah,
forward.
and so this isn't a slam on that moment. It just was a perfect exemplar of why.
Are you still on the list?
Sorry.
He took over the list. How about Ms. Wimhoff then? Wow.
Did you get on the
There's
list?
a list today.
I'm on the list right now.
Yeah.
I think that is a good example of that. I also think that is not a good example it's a good example for not keeping things away. That was what I thought was fairly harmless. It could have been voted up or down by this body. I think the body could have had an opinion on it, and it became agitated when it was simply a resolution. And being a new member, trying to postpone it just to keep people from yelling at each other became very confusing. And at the one point, and when I asked for information, I didn't get quite the information that I was hoping to get. But the idea that of pulling it, withdrawing it indefinitely, in the end was really not what I should have done, but it was something that might be good for both parties, so perhaps they can have communication now. And so I think that's what the point of bringing that up was. That resolution would have caused the parties to have to work with an owner. And so that was pushing communication. But it became something that I don't know what happened to that. But anyway, I thank you for I needed to say something about
We'll
that.
go back to the list, but we are just, that was just an example, but we're just.
It was a good example.
Okay, but.
And I'm finished. I'm not on the list anymore.
Okay, Mr. Dunbar. I have a list.
So I have a
Sorry,
proposed,
Mr.
I have a
President.
proposed solution, and we can debate it and not do this if you don't want. But I have been persuaded that there are resolutions. I think that was a good example. Resolutions that are non-binding, don't require public hearing, but I don't want laid on the table. It is also the case that those, like again, like puppy week resolutions.
National Meteorologist.
Well, the point is that those
Ours
are.
was not laid
Ours
on the
wasn't laid
table.
on the table.
Oh, well, but you'd have to, okay, fair enough. It was on the addendum as well? Okay.
Yeah.
That's fine. So, but, okay, yours wasn't, okay, but something like that was laid on the table, I wouldn't want that to happen.
Okay.
And if you have something that contentious, even if it's on the addendum, it's probably, what's gonna happen is exactly what happened. But my point is, like, that kind of resolution, the other kind of resolution, I am fine with us trying to prevent those from being laid on the table. So my proposal is that we restore A and actually take out the last part, only upon affirmative vote of 8 members, because there is, when you do a motion to incorporate, there is that protection. You are going to get a majority vote, right? And then if it does end up on the consent agenda, you can pull it back out and have another vote on it, right? But so if I would leave in under exceptional circumstances such as financial emergencies, natural disasters, or when immediate assembly action on a matter is essential to meaningful and blah 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 blah, because of the financial the resolutions. But what the administration comes to us fairly frequently and says, this wasn't ready to go on Friday. It became ready to go on Monday. We really need to spend this money or make this purchase or whatever it is. And I want us that ability.
It just.
And I know it's not ideal, but it's realistic given the operation of the city.
I wanted this discussion, but it forces us to just acknowledge it. It forces us to say, there's a reason for this. And if we have to say there's a reason for a while, yeah, at some point people go like, well then stop doing that, or let's do these more, yeah. But just a simple majority, you say.
Well, yeah, I guess the interesting thing there is, let's say we restore A, take out the last part about the 8 members.
Yeah.
Then the question is how you operationalize that, because they're going to lay it on the table. The administration say they'll lay 3 things on the table, and then at what point do we have a discussion about does this fit our exception or not?
It's Mr. Falsey, why wasn't this on the regular agenda? And he said, because, and why is this so important? We need to discuss it now, or can we delay it? And he says, 1 and 2 absolutely have to go today because of the blah, 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 blah. And we stare at him and like, so 3 can be delayed? Yeah, so
But
delay 3 to go.
Is that a norm or a rule we want to incorporate into A?
I think it's a procedure we want to incorporate into A. Mr. Weddleton, Mr. Trainer, and Mr. Cross.
This might seem really minor, but instead of saying emergency, like say financial urgency, because emergency does kind of imply the bridge fell down. An urgency is that we just got to accept this $10,000 grant or something. And I think emergency, it's already spoken to in charter, right? So we're saying it's a little bit lower bar.
Yeah, I don't want
But
these
other-
to overlap,
yeah.
in any, you know,
Right.
so we shouldn't use the same terminology.
And maybe yank out natural disasters if that's already clearly in the charter. But that's where we're talking financial urgency, something they threw out that we got to get this done today. It's not exactly an emergency. But I'd agree with Forrest and take out that last bit about, at least 8 members. And one thing that, it's not critical, I've done it I think once, but if I have something ready to go and I say, oh gosh, I want to get it on the addendum this time, but I'll have public hearing in a month. But that lets me get 4 weeks of flagging the public it's there instead of 2. And if I'm not allowed to do that, okay, well, Dean will wait and he'll put it in there
You can
2
get on the
weeks
addendum,
later.
you just can't miss the addendum and try and throw it.
Lay it on the table.
Well, I might lay it on the table. Sometimes,
Yeah.
so it's like, how critical is that? Well, there's some things you kind of want to get it done
Right.
quicker, but I got it ready. Let me give people a month notice. And so that's good public process, and we'd be, in those instances, pulling that away.
That's right. Mr. Train.
No, Eric, every chairman's had to deal with this over the years. It depends, the chairperson has had to deal with this issue. And they tell the administration, we don't want to lay it on the table. And that's fine for a while, and then later on you get a change in the chair, or you get a change in the mayor, and they creep back up again. It's a constant thing you've got to fight against. Sometimes we do it to ourselves. Remember when Alan Cheshire was on this Sunday with me? Alan loved to throw lay on the table when I was on there, because he'd like to agitate the administration. We did not want to tell him what we were doing, so he'd throw lay on the table while I was on.
Yeah,
It's just something happens.
I think that's an example of what we want
Want
to
to be able to do.
No, we want to be able to not do. We want to
Flexibility.
Mr. Constant.
Tom's been here.
So, oh boy.
Alan Tessie arguing with Tom Fick.
Oh, it was fun.
What a time to be alive.
So,
We all just get along.
all of this conversation in some ways stretches to the addendum as well. The addendum is published 48 hours before a meeting, and if, the intent is to have maximum public participation, 48 hours is certainly limited. And so whatever we contemplate for laying on the table items at some point in the future, we also should be contemplating the systems placed around the addendum, because it's the whole in between your public hearing items 2 weeks out and your stuff that people are going to pull out of their pocket 6 hours before a meeting. And so it's just a thought to the future.
Mr. Train.
Eric, do we need to redefine what published is? It used to be on the Daily News. You say published in there, but we do electronic now. Do we need to specify electronically published? Because we couldn't afford the Daily News anymore. It's the reason we went to electronic. Do we need to have that as an option listed there as publishing just good enough the way it's written?
So on page 3, D,
Right.
we added just for that reason, Mr. Chairman, reasonable public notice of a regular assembly meeting shall be accomplished by publication of a written posting of the meeting date, time, and location on the municipal public notice webpage. So we say the webpage, I think, for the first time. And then public notice of the title. Yeah, that's what publish.
Okay, I just want to see, because when I look at the beginning of page 3, I look at line 2. You need to do it at line 3, shall be published. I just want to make sure
Yeah,
our
that's
electronic
good.
version covers it
I
there.
believe if Dean might know if there's a place within the code where it is clearly defined, because I thought that the clerk at our last meeting talked about how that was the case where it used to say the paper, but there was a change to the code that now says non-public. Dean, do you know about that reference?
There is a place in Title 1 in the general definitions, we revised the definition for publish like 2009 or something. It will mean publishing on the municipality's public notice webpage, and it optional is to publish in newspapers as optional, unless it's otherwise required by state law. Something like that.
Sure, yes.
Just one thought on this reference to the web page, that you might not want to limit it only to the web page in case what happened to the Matsu Valley and Valdez in terms of a virus happens to us, and then suddenly you have no web page for a month or something, but you still have to do business and have to get public notice out.
So what would you put there?
Vague?
I think our existing language, I'd have to look it up, but I think it already covers what's being done, because it talks about being able to use an alternative method. it's fairly general, but it would leave that door open.
If we had legal check for us before Tuesday, that would help.
Yeah, will you send me that reference just in case, or maybe incorporate it into that provision? Appreciate your indulgence on this. It's something the clerk's office worries about, and I wanted the assembly members' comments on it. When there's time in a work session, we're not required to, but when there's time, we can take public comments. Do you want to comment? Are you proud of us for talking about this?
Okay.
Good.
My name is Eugene Carrierman. I live in Mexico Valley. Follow the public process. And public process is appropriate. Made by the governing body is more likely than public interest. Yes, I'm glad you are on this issue. I respond to that question. But what I've addressed over the years, and not in plural, with over different mayors, different assembly members, is with my audit of public process, that I see you're doing some changes with respect to me. I see you questioning and addressing those issues. But as a line I used before, more complicated issues, more notice, more opportunity to be heard. Certainly this is the key of what to do in connecting with people. You need to really allow a lot of time on this subject. And you are also changing the assembly members shortly, and it'll happen approximately April 17th. I'm dealing with approximately dealing with certification. So I caution you to make decisions before new assembly members are present. But the discussion is important. I grab that. But I also like to give you a couple of things that stand out. Number one, the idea of connecting with the community councils. They meet generally once a month. You introduce something at one meeting, and then 2 weeks later, you have a public hearing, and generally you only have one public hearing. It doesn't connect with the community council. So when you discuss how you're really changing the situation, another thing that pops out is your meeting starts at 5 o'clock. It should start at 6 o'clock. Your agenda is the bulk of it between 5 and 6. There's no chance for the public. And I remind the chairs, the last two chairs with the comments, that when I go up there, any other public, when you go up to the very end on audience participation, you can speak on only items that are not on the agenda. So all those items that were at 5 o'clock to 6 o'clock, there was no chance. Now I heard the words over a course of time is, well, they have an opportunity to send you emails or whatever, written communications. But then that is not really fairly connecting with the public, and the public to see those communications. And that's not the way to go. And then the last thing is, just because there's a resolution or whatever you're putting out, and it says you don't have to have it as a public hearing, it's not illegal for you to have a public hearing on that item. Okay? And then these are just some of the things I see. And as far as the laid on the table, I would say one word about that whole idea about laid on the table. You need to ban it. One complete ban. The only time you need to deal with something of urgency that you're shortening the scenario is, for example, the earthquake. And then you change the rules. In fact, you have a code there, which I question how you did it, waiving your right to do out any rules. So, and then you need to also, in closing, move yourself from this room where you have outside the act and meet there, video, audio, and have that information there and the public engaged and time for the public to speak. And my time is up with you.
Your time is up.
Yes, Mr. Chair. Thank
Go ahead,
you.
then.
Actually, I had a question that is along the lines of something Mr. Haberman brought up. And the question is, if we do have a resolution that one of us is sponsoring that we suspect will have significant interest, can we just go ahead then and include it on the addendum to be introduced for public hearing, or what's the process then for a resolution? Is that what you do, is you just make the request and then it's
Yeah, then it'll be on the
Introduced.
addendum as opposed to laid on the table. And as you guys said,
Well,
yours
yeah.
was on the addendum.
was on the addendum as a resolution under the consent agenda, which we intended to pull as it was and schedule, request postponement. So I'm just wondering, an alternative path would have been to have asked for it not to have been included on the consent agenda.
Have a track that is.
But, I mean, how do you do that? You just,
Well, you could have set it for the consent agenda, but also had it set for public hearing, so it was clear that it wasn't passing that night.
How do you do that, I think is the question. I mean, how do you put it on the agenda?
No. So you do the same thing you did. You could put it in the regular agenda or the addendum. It's
And
just
then we
clear that
did-
when you
we did
submit
go
the
to
resolution, it
postpone it.
includes a public hearing date. And Dean or Dee, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you could do that with any resolution. You could say, in this case, even though I don't need one, I want you to set it for public hearing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
The way
we,
you do that is you put it in just below the title
So
bar
we
and
could have done-
tell the clerk staff or whoever is, the agenda staff, however it's getting into the agenda, please set this for public hearing, and then it's just right on the record.
so the maker can decide whether or not there's public hearing. It doesn't have to be.
In the cases where it's not,
The
where public
maker
hearing isn't
can
required.
And then
propose.
it will be
That's the
prematurely
handbook you
high
gave
bar.
me. Did you see that?
What handbook, dude? That was the fire hose. remember?
It's very rare. So it's not.
Yeah, I thought it was frowned
As he
upon.
said, as Mr. Hickman said, there's no prohibition on things having a public hearing, so you requested. And you're right that it's technically the body approving, but I don't see any reason why, I want a public hearing on this, they do it.
I mean, it's a good learning moment too for this.
Just to remember, the community council are not part of the city government. They're not for profit organization. The charter recognizes them, but they're not part of the city government. Okay.
And they're not
Because-
insured.
So I had a
Sure,
question.
you normally defend them in court.
That Dean said, no, we can't change that because it's in the charter. And that is a question for the three legal minds in the room. So, under the emergency, or more, I guess there are more.
No, you were right the first time.
Legal minds, our employees. The emergency declaration and the powers granted requires 3/4 of the members or a majority of those present, according to what I read. And my question is, what's the protection of the body and the public if a faction of the body got together and declared an emergency and tried to pull some shenanigan if a majority of those present can achieve the declaration of an emergency? And I know the mayor has a veto within a certain amount of time, but to me, that's a question I have. No, you don't have to have a quorum. If you have an emergency and
I think it's built for that, right? If you got half of us decimated in that freak.
Well, there's a legal opinion from the
skateboarding
municipal attorney that the mayor can in fact veto any action taken by this unstated judge. To include even vetoing the chairman designation by herself.
Well, we are right up at 3:30, Mr.
I think
Gates.
for the-
Take us away, take us out.
I think for the emergency ordinance passage, the 3/4 is of the entire membership, and there's a clause or a unanimous vote of those present. So,
And so if you have 3 members present, what's to protect the public? They
Well,
declare
it has
an
to be a
emergency.
quorum, right?
or there's a requirement to try and reach out and get everybody there.
Guys?
Due diligence. We need to look it out. To
I would
exactly
like
what
to
it
know an
says,
answer to
but-
that question, because it's a weird thing, but it could be abused, I would think, and probably it's been worked out. I would love to know how.
Yeah, so I think there's a little parable within the legal profession that says hard cases make for bad law. And I just to caution you, and this is now 25 years of experience, that if you try to take care of every possible exception like that, you get so hogtied, and it's just like the legislature's modifying some of the ethics laws they put on themselves because they fence them in, they can't hardly talk to anybody, so I just caution us, I think it was Eisenhower said, don't look, the pursuit is a perfect, keep you from doing the possible, or something like that. It's a good case to bring it up, but ultimately in our systems, the doesn't tolerate people of goodwill or bad will for a long period of time. And no matter how disengaged our people are, finally they get it. This guy is a world-class anal sphincter and not be in a position of making decisions or stopping them from happening. And,
Right to the chair.
On that, let's move over to Board of Equalization.